Welcome and thank you for virtually attending our 2021 online Tualatin Watershed Invasive Species Team Workshop, formerly Tualatin Watershed Weed Watchers Workshop. Last year, we had a record number of people sign up at 158. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy during the COVID-19 pandemic. The main purpose of this workshop is to get you familiar with how to identify and report priority invasive plants in the Tualatin Watershed in Oregon. We will briefly cover control options and are happy to follow up with you after the presentation to answer any species-specific control questions. Now we're going to do a brief round of introductions. My name is Tyler Pedersen. I am the Invasive Species Program Coordinator for the Tualatin SWCD.
I am Olivia Hurd, an Invasive Species Technician at the Tualatin SWCD.
I'm Trevor Norman with Tualatin SWCD and Invasive Species Technician.
And I'm Robert Emanuel. I'm a Water Resources Project Manager at Clean Water Services in Hillsborough.
Next, I'm going to give a brief overview of what the Tualatin SWCD, what our mission and vision are. The Tualatin SWC's mission is to provide technical assistance, financial assistance, and education in order to create a sustainable, productive, healthy environment for the Washington County community. We identify natural resource challenges and use both time-tested methods and cutting-edge research to determine solutions. Working with residents, we help our community implement sustainable solutions to conserve and enhance natural resources. The Tualatin SWCD's vision works to create a sustainable, productive, and healthy environment for the Washington County community. We are non-regulatory, we are local, we are connectors, and we serve everyone. The district was formed in the 1950s and is one of 45 SWCDs in Oregon. It was originally created to assist rural agricultural landowners, but with our recent tax base, we've been able to add staff and develop new programs like the Invasive Species Program, and branch out into urban areas. There are 7 district programs: rural, urban, invasives, forest, habitat conservation, conservation education, and grants and funding. Currently, the district is comprised of 17 staff. The Invasive Species Program was established in 2018 and has grown to 1 coordinator and 2 technicians. We control and survey target species, increase public awareness, and collaborate with partners and residents to prevent the spread of invasive species. Currently, we focus our on-the-ground control work on invasive plants. There are 4 invasives program elements. We offer technical assistance to control common weeds, on-the-ground financial assistance to survey and control early detection rapid response weeds. We offer tool rentals for landowners, like our weed wrenches, and we provide these twist workshops for residents and city, county, and state agencies. This workshop was previously known as the Tualatin Watershed Weed Watchers Workshop, and just previously, this last year, we updated our logo in our name for the program. So it's now known as TWIST, which stands for Tualatin Watershed Invasive Species Team. This is a partnership between residents, volunteers, nonprofits, and government agencies. Volunteers and staff look for and report EDRR species in the Tualatin River watershed. By taking this workshop, you are now part of our team.
So just 25 state-listed noxious weeds in Oregon is estimated to reduce Oregonians' personal income by $83.5 million annually, equivalent to 1,900 jobs lost to Oregon's economy. If left to spread, it could cost an estimated $1.8 billion in economic impact in Oregon. This was spoken by Governor Kate Brown in 2019 and displays the importance of learning about these plants and understanding the effects they have on our economy. Understanding proper control strategies are instrumental to effectively combating noxious weeds. So here we have an EDRR curve. The invasion curve depicts the spread of noxious weeds if left unchecked. The left axis shows the area of invasion by the noxious weed, The right is the cost of controlling the invasive species, and the horizontal axis represents the infestation time span. So if left unchecked, a weed increases in cost to control and area occupied over time. So as time increases, so does infestation size. We focus on invasive species in the early detection phase. Detecting noxious weeds early helps to keep them from reaching a level in which they are no longer able to be controlled. Early detection occurs when an invasive species is detected in an area before it has the chance to explode in population over a given area. So there is a point in which eradication on a regional scale is no longer feasible. An example of that would be blackberry, ivy, or holly, which has reached the point that it's been widespread and can't be controlled on a larger scale, but may be controlled on a site-specific level. So here we have the IPM pyramid, IPM standing for Integrated Pest Management. Each tile represents a different control method used to control noxious weeds. We'll start at the bottom here with prevention, which is also the largest tile. Practices such as brushing your boots, not composting invasive plant fragments, and learning about these invasive species all goes towards prevention. Educating yourself on the life systems of these weeds and how to identify them helps us get on the ball early. So the second tile up, the cultural and sanitation tile, represents certain control methods such as plant selection, prescribed burns, and crop rotation, essentially suppressing the weeds by removing the requisites for survival. Practices such as cover crops is an example of this. The third tile up is the physical and mechanical control method. Things such as physically pulling plants and mowing certain invasive species can help depending on the plant species. The third tile up is the biological control methods. This refers to insects or funguses from the invasive species native range that feed on it and utilize it as part of their life cycle. There's a lot of research done before biological controls are introduced to the ecosystem to make sure that they're not going to influence the ecology of our native ecosystems. And then the last tile at the top here is the chemical control methods. Herbicides are the smallest portion of a larger control scheme and are only used when necessary and all other options are exhausted. So we'll jump right into our first invasive species here. This is garlic mustard. It was originally brought over from Europe for culinary and ornamental purposes in the 19th century. It's a large threat to our stream and forest ecosystems in Western Oregon. Garlic mustard outcompetes native species by having a very fast life cycle, and also the ability to self-pollinate. It has prolific seeding habits as well. Large monocultures of garlic mustard decrease biodiversity, which negatively impacts wildlife by decreasing forage. Garlic mustard releases a chemical from its root known as sinigrin, which is toxic to the underground fungus that a lot of plants utilize to uptake nutrients. Garlic mustard does not need this plant-fungi relationship, so it essentially creates an environment that only it can live in. Garlic mustard spreads when seeds hitch a ride on car tires, equipment, boots, clothing, and animals' fur. Seed pods also scatter seeds near the original plant when mature. Flooding events and moving water exacerbate the situation by spreading seeds through floodplains and downstream to new areas. Garlic mustard is also known to have low levels of cyanide, so it's not really a safe plant to eat. It also contains chemicals that are toxic to some butterfly species. Garlic mustard is bee-listed in Oregon, and it's a biennial plant that grows in 2 growth phases. It begins life as a rosette, emerging in the fall to early March. Rosettes, they become mature by midsummer, and they remain as rosettes for their first year of growth. You can see in the top left photo a garlic mustard rosette. It has dark green leaves that are kidney-shaped with scalloped edges. These leaves generally grow to be about 2 to 4 inches across, and if you crush them in your fingers, they do actually have a faint scent of garlic. The roots can be S or hook-shaped and can sometimes grow even when exposed to the air. In the second year of growth, the rosette bolts to become a flowering plant, generally between April and May. That's when it begins, is April to May. These flowering plants generally grow to be about 3 feet tall, but they can get quite a bit taller, sometimes 5 feet, or grow a little bit smaller at only a few inches. Flowering stalks have triangular shaped leaves that are arranged alternately from the stem, growing from 1 to 3 inches wide. They become progressively smaller as you go up the stem. The flowers begin to develop in April, growing in clusters at the end of stems, and they have 4 small white petals in the shape of a cross. Again, garlic mustard is capable of self-fertilization, so one plant can essentially create a whole new infestation just through self-pollination. So the seed pods, also known as saliques, are 1 to 2 inch long and kind of narrow. You can see them in the bottom right photo here. They ripen by mid-June, and on average, they contain about 16 seeds. Each plant can produce over 600 seeds a year. The seeds are small, black, and shiny, and are capable of remaining viable in the soil from 5 to 10 years. So it's most easy to spot in spring when the flowers are visible and the stalks are tall. Look for those clustered white flowers with the triangular leaves. However, the rosettes can be seen year round, although in the winter they do tend to get obscured by the leaf litter. You can find garlic mustard growing along roadsides, streams and rivers and riparian areas, in the right-of-way, along trails, and in forests. But just make sure to brush your boots and clean your clothing when visiting these infested areas. So garlic mustard is pretty widespread in Western Oregon. The most affected areas are in the Portland metro area and in the Columbia River Gorge. In Washington County, garlic mustard has been observed on Fano, Gales, Johnson, Abbey, Ward, and Rock Creeks, and as well as many other tributaries. Many upland locations are also affected by garlic mustard infestations in Washington County, and known streamside infestations have been treated for over 10 years. So one disclaimer for this presentation is if you live outside of Washington County, make sure to check in with your local county weed manager to find out which species they are prioritizing for report and treatment. But when in doubt, please report it to the invasive species hotline. So we have a few lookalikes to garlic mustard, which sometimes confuses the observer. At the top left here, we have fringe cup, which is a native species in Western Oregon. It does kind of look like garlic mustard rosettes just because the leaves share a similar shape and they kind of tend to grow in the same areas. They're both low growing and share the similar habitat. You can tell the difference because fringe cup has leaves that are hairy as well as the stalks. The flowering stems produce a very different flower than garlic mustard as well, kind of just a bell-shaped flower instead of that 4-petaled flower. The leaves on the flowering stems also clasp the stem, whereas garlic mustards have the stalk. At the top right here, we have ground ivy, which looks very similar to garlic mustard, especially when observing it from above. This forms dense carpets on the forest floor. It's also an invasive species. Ground ivy has square creeping stems and doesn't grow as a rosette. And the flowers also are purple and very dissimilar to garlic mustards. So you can tell the difference just by observing the stems of creeping Charlie or ground ivy, since garlic mustard doesn't have those creeping stems at all. On the bottom left is money plant, which is similar to a flowering garlic mustard plant. You can tell they kind of look similar because they grow to the same stature and the leaves kind of share a similar shape. But you can tell the difference because the leaves near the top of the flowering stem clasp the stem, kind of like fringe cup. And again, garlic mustard does not have a leaf that clasps the stem, they have a stalk. When they're in bloom, it's pretty easy to tell the difference just because the flowers are purple instead of white. And the seed pods that they produce are actually circular, flat, and kind of coin shapes. So hence the name money plant, and nothing like the saliques of garlic mustard. On the bottom right, we have nipplewort, which is kind of a troublesome weed, especially in garden areas. It shares a similar stature when flowering to garlic mustard. However, that rosette on the left there, you can see doesn't look very similar to garlic mustards. They're both, it's a non-native, it's also a biennial. And they both have small flowers that grow at the end. The flowering stems leaves do look similar to garlic mustards. However, those flowers are yellow, not white, and don't really look like garlic mustards at all.
Next up, we have knotweed. The woody knotweeds are truly the Godzilla of the weeds we're going to talk about here today, as long as we're making comparisons. They are composed of very large plants, very easy to identify. They are profligate producers of biomass, and they will rapidly outcompete native plants and reduce biodiversity because they produce so much growth. They can grow between 5 and 15 feet. I've seen them as tall as 20. They will block sunlight. They will produce thickets that spring from their rhizomes. Their rhizomes or root systems are very extensive and very deep. They can send up stalks up to 65 feet away from the mother plant, and they can grow for literally acres. Their dead stems will continue to persist in the wintertime, producing a thicket of bamboo-like stems. And most native herbivores will not consume this plant. Along waterways, they're famous for displacing most of the native streamside vegetation. Anything that is not as tall as knotweed will be pushed quickly out of the way. They will replace riparian habitats with a monoculture of knotweed stems. And even as pieces clog the stream itself, they'll fall into the stream and move with flooding. They can cause extreme issues for local folks who are experiencing knotweed infestations on construction sites. They can push through home sites. They can break up concrete and asphalt. They can be very, very expensive to remove, often requiring heavy equipment or lots of herbicide. And they will grow in places that you would not expect to find them. They tend to spread by all different means, particularly with stem pieces as small as ½ an inch. Once those touch soil or moisture, they will develop rhizomes that'll spread in all directions, like I said, up to 65 feet. During floods, they can be swept into rivers and creeks, which will carry them downstream and form new colonies. They can be moved around in fill dirt. So for example, if they're excavated out of a construction site, that fill dirt is contaminated with them and just gets moved to a new location. Be very careful to not put plant fragments, if you know this information, in your yard debris, for example, because we do not know if the composting process will kill woody knotweed fragments and could spread it around the county. They will also occasionally produce seed, and we're not sure if seed production is occurring in our communities in Western Oregon, but because of our lack of knowledge on this, it's good to consider that any seed they produce is potentially viable. And if it is viable, it can last for up to 15 years. They're winged and they disperse very easily from the parent plant by wind and by water. This is a B-listed weed. It's been common enough in Western Oregon and other parts of the state that it is becoming ubiquitous in some locations. It has 4 species. The main ones around here are Japanese knotweed and Bohemian knotweed, but we also see giant knotweed and another species on the coast called Himalayan knotweed. It grows 5 to 15 feet tall, depending on the species, the giant being the largest, and it forms clumps around the root crown. So you would see a very large clumping plant similar to a bamboo. It's one of the plants that I like to say can be identified at 50 miles an hour traveling along a road. Leaves are alternate. They have smooth edges. They vary in size depending on the species, but with giant knotweed, they can be up to 15 inches long. They're generally heart-shaped or with a rounded tip, and Japanese knotweed will have 3 to 6 inch long leaves with a blunt base and a pointed tip. The flowers are small and they're clustered. They tend to be very white or greenish colored. They are usually at the ends of the stems. You find those in July, August, and September as the plants bloom prolifically. And their stems are very distinctive. They look very much like a bamboo. They are hollow and they're jointed. And knotweeds are all generally greenish, but in the springtime, as they're emerging, they will emerge with a bright reddish coloration, and then they mature to a deeper green. Last year's dead stems will usually be visible around the new growth. And the stems will normally begin to sprout from the rhizome in late spring. Warmer temperatures lead to earlier sprouting times, and they're easiest to identify when they're in full bloom or full size, with those big clouds of white flowers and full high stems and large leaves. Where to look for these things? Look for them in a variety of different habitats. They'll grow from upland to lowland, but most commonly seen in our zone, closest to streams and rivers. They are thirsty plants and appreciate the moisture. They can also be found in disturbed sites along roadways and the edges of forests, in landscaped areas, and in upland sites. These species are also all interchangeable in that they are readily able to hybridize. So here you have a graphic showing the different sizes of leaves. Don't be surprised if you come across very large leaves. It could be anything from a giant knotweed to a hybrid knotweed, also called Bohemian knotweed, or you might find the more pedestrian Japanese knotweed. And if you're on the coast, you may find the Himalayan knotweed. But keep in mind, these are all very large, very leafy plants with those very distinctive jointed stems. Knotweed is widely distributed in Western Oregon and also has some appearance in Eastern and Southern Oregon now. Unfortunately, it has become very common on the coast and in the Willamette Valley. Washington County has some degree of hybridized knotweeds, mostly the one that we commonly call Bohemian knotweed. And it's generally found around here growing in disturbed areas. We found it in yards, in water quality facilities, and particularly along streams. We have been treating this weed for a long time, and it is beginning to reduce its frequency, but it is still common enough, and reports are very much welcomed. The plant has a look-alike. The native plant known as red osier dogwood or red stem dogwood is a plant that will commonly also be found along streams and has a very large distinctive leaf in the summertime and lovely white flowers. The flowers are in more of an umbel shape or a flat top, kind of like an umbrella, whereas knotweeds, they will stand up like a head of hair after a bad hair day. And the plants in knotweed will have large joints, and it's an herbaceous plant. It's kind of funny to tell that from a plant so big, but it will die back completely in the winter, whereas knotweed or dogwood is commonly a perennial shrub. And so those beautiful red stems will persist all year, and it will be particularly woody. Next one is also a really large weed. We are talking about a plant that I feel would be most commonly found as a backdrop for dinosaurs if we had them in Oregon. This is the giant hogweed. This is a very tall plant as well, another giant, 10 to 20 feet tall in full bloom. It has a huge umbrella of flowers, also called an umbel. It has very, very hollow stalks and these brilliantly red to purple raised blotches that have a single bristled hair in the center of each of the blotches. They are large leaves. The leaves are 2 to 5 feet wide, and the seeds are small, flat brown seeds that can float on the water or even blow in the wind, much like a maple. When you find these are usually when they are in full height and full bloom, which is from May to July. And they will typically be found in unmaintained areas, vacant lots, near roadsides. They love water, so they will be near streams, along lakes, and sometimes in gardens, unfortunately. Be very careful of giant hogweed. Giant hogweed is one of the few plants that we talk about in this presentation that is particularly toxic. When it produces a sap and the sap is in contact with your skin, it can produce a burn, and the burn will reappear whenever you are exposed to sunlight. So it causes what we call phytosensitivity. And this is a very toxic effect of the plant. So when you see giant hogweed or even a lookalike, don't touch it. Giant hogweed originally came from Eastern Europe and the Eurasian mountains, the Caucasus. It was imported from Europe and North America early 20th century, actually as a horticultural plant. It was used in private gardens, and it has since escaped and spread west. Because it spreads by seed, and those seeds move so well by wind, water, or even people or animals moving them, it has wide distribution, and it's easy to see how it would spread. It can remain viable in the soil for up to 10 years, and it's mostly found in Western Oregon. We have a few historical records of it on the coast in Clatsop County, but for the most part, it has been found in Washington and Multnomah and Clackamas counties. It is an extremely easy to spread plant. And because of that, we want to try to hit it as quickly as possible. It is a high priority weed, according to the Oregon Department of Agriculture. There are very few known sites here in Washington County. The one place that it is most common is along Fano Creek, in Beaverton, and in Tigard. So if you live in those locations, please watch for this plant. It has several lookalike species, and it can be tricky to identify. All of us have probably committed ourselves to a false positive, so don't be shy about reporting something, even if you're not 100% sure of it. Giant hogweed will be by far the largest of the three species we'll talk about here. The other two are cow parsnip, which is a very close relative, and poison hemlock, which is also a relative. Both of these plants are potentially poisonous, although cow parsnip is not as quite as toxic as its other relatives here. And cow parsnip and giant hogweed have some of the closest lookalikes in that their leaf shapes are very similar, since they are essentially cousins. Giant hogweed will have a more incised and deeply cut leaf, whereas cow parsnip will have a more open leaf that you could cover up more of yourself, which should you be brave enough to put it over your head. As Olivia demonstrates here in this photo with two posters, these are life-size posters of both the plants. The giant hogweed is actually 11 feet in that photo, whereas cow parsnip is about 7 feet. So if you found cow parsnip blooming in the wild, you still might find you were underneath it. But if you found giant hogweed, it would be very distinctive and very much larger. And on the left side of this slide, you'll see the giant hogweed standing next to cow parsnip, and see how much taller it is when it's in full bloom.
Okay. The next species we're going to talk about is spurge laurel. Spurge laurel was originally an ornamental that was brought over from Europe, and it escaped people's yards and gardens. It does contain a toxic sap, but not nearly as toxic as giant hogweed. The sap can come from the stem or from breaking the leaves, and it can cause respiratory irritation when touched or inhaled. And if you eat any of the little berries, it can cause nausea, vomiting, or swelling. This is especially important if you have little children who like to stick things in their mouths. It often grows in very dense thickets, not just a single plant. So it often crowds out native understory species and doesn't allow them to get any sunlight. It is not palatable or edible by wildlife and can cause sickness in them as well. It makes forest very difficult to traverse for wildlife because of these very dense thickets. It is B-listed in Oregon, and its leaves are dark green, evergreen. They don't lose their leaves in the winter. oblong shaped, and they're arranged in a spiral around the stem, almost like a staircase. They're 1 to 5 inches long, usually larger at the bottom and getting smaller towards the top. The flowers are small, bell-shaped, and emit a slight honey fragrance, but I wouldn't recommend getting close enough to smell them. They are greenish yellow and often hidden amongst the foliage under the very top leaves, as you can see in the bottom left photo. It blooms from March to May, so it's one of those early bloomers, and it is blooming about this time of year. Its berries are egg-shaped, and they start out green and turn to a dark purple or black, almost like an olive. It's spread mainly by birds that carry the berries to new locations. This is often found under power lines or other areas where birds roost because their droppings can leave these berries behind. Its stems, it can grow up to 4 feet tall. Often you find it between 2 and 3 feet. It's shrubby and can contain many stems coming from a single base. It can regrow very easily from broken roots or stems, and it's woody, but kind of rubbery and bends before it breaks. You can look for this plant all year round because of its evergreen leaves. It prefers very shady conditions or on forest edges. It's commonly found in forest gardens, parks, or natural areas, and very common where birds roost, especially starlings at the base of trees. Spurge laurel is very common in Western Oregon and can also be found in several central Oregon counties. In Washington County, spurge laurel is particularly common on the east side of the county near the West Hills. There's quite a few properties there that we know have had spurge laurel, and we're working to help them remove it from their property. Due to spurge laurel being distributed by birds, the populations can pop up sporadically and are hard to track down. The next species we're going to talk about is false brome. False brome creates dense stands and suppresses native seed germination. Infested sites often lack native biodiversity, and it displaces grasses needed by wildlife for forage. It does produce great shelter for rodents, which like to girdle trees, but that's often not desired. Low severity fires can actually increase false brome germination. False brome is often one of the first plants to grow back after a fire, usually within 2 weeks. The understory burns that leave ample room for false brome to invade. And false brome is drought resistant and is often spreading into larger areas with climate change. False brome has low palatability or edibility by livestock and wildlife. And there's a fungus that grows linked to health defects in sheep, but this fungus that can grow in symbiosis with the false brome has not been found in Oregon yet, but it has been found in other parts of North America. It spreads by several hundred seeds annually. The seeds can be picked up by boots, tires, clothing, pets, and animal fur. They can also be spread by logging equipment because it's often in those shady areas that are being logged. It is B-listed in Oregon. One very distinguishing feature of it is it has very hairy stems and leaves, as you can see in that upper left corner photo. The leaves are bright green and often have a droopy appearance, and they have a single row of hairs along the edge. And the leaves can be up to 10 inches long. The flowers grow in a spikelet at the end of the stem, and the spikelets often lack a stalk, so the seed is directly attached to the stem. Flowering stems can get up to 2 feet tall and are 2 to 5 inches long. It often flowers May to July and drops seed in June. False brome forms clumps, and dead leaf blades are often found around these clumps. It has a very overall droopy appearance, both the leaves and the inflorescence. It is often the only green grass that you can find in winter due to its bright green colored blades. when you should look for it. You can look for this species all year round due to its bright colored leaves. And it's easiest in winter because most other grasses and plants die back in the winter or go into dormancy. This species often stays bright and green, making it easy to spot. It is often found in coniferous forests, logged areas, upland prairies, and riparian forests. False brome is particularly common near Eugene and Corvallis and has spread throughout much of Western Oregon. There's several sites in Washington County that host false brome, though more data is needed to properly assess the current populations within Washington County and the Tualatin Watershed. One species that often can be confused with false brome is Columbia brome. The difference is you can see that the spikelets on the Columbia brome are stalked, and the false brome, there is no stalk, so the seed is directly connected to the stem.
Our next weed is oblong spurge. Oblong spurge is a member of the euphorbia group of plants, and it is a garden origin weed. It is found mostly in the Portland metro area, having escaped from many people's gardens. It's a perennial, grows up to 3 feet tall. It can be very leafy, but is most distinctive when it's in bright yellow bloom. The bloom is adorned with a bright yellow bract around individual groups of flowers, which are quite tiny. It grows very rapidly and it outcompetes native plants. It forms really dense stands that are often devoid of native species, and it can be toxic to many native herbivorous animals and of course to livestock. It exudes a toxic sap that is not good for humans either. It can cause skin irritation. And as I said earlier, it is poisonous to many mammals. It spreads by seed, and those seeds are ejected from distinctive capsules that can burst open and spread the seed several feet away by small explosions. The sticky seed has a coating that will allow it to stick to people, to vehicles, to animals, and be moved around. Because of its toxicity and its issues with rapidity of spread, it is A and T listed weed in Oregon, meaning it's got a very large emphasis from the Oregon Department of Agriculture wanting to eliminate it. It's a perennial, and like I said, up to 3 feet tall. Each clump will form up to 20 stems, and it may grow in very large thickets that are composed of smaller plants. With those branching stems and whorled leaves closer to the end of the stems, it can be very distinctive. The leaves are egg-shaped or lance-shaped, and they're usually a couple of inches long, and they have tiny, fine teeth around the edges. The flowers will cluster at the end of those branches, and they're, like I said, small and yellow, but surrounded by large yellow bracts that give it a very bright color and attract pollinators to it. It has seed pods that are bumpy and spherical little capsules that are at least half a centimeter long. And when you would look for this is typically when it's in flower. So March through August, it would form large fields or large thickets of bright yellow flowers. Typically found in moist settings, along damp meadows, the edges of forests, along roadsides, and along streams as well. It can be found in people's yards, and it is grown as an ornamental, but because it is an A-listed weed, it is no longer sold by nurseries in the state of Oregon. Oblong spurge is distributed typically just around the Portland metro area. So the almost four counties of the metro area have the most oblong spurge, and we're hoping not to see it spread further. New infestations are being found in Washington County, but we really need more data to understand where they are and how they're moving. So mapping it with your help is very, very important. Our next weed is goat's rue. Goat's rue is a very special species. It was initially introduced to the US intentionally in 1891 as an experimental forage for livestock. However, we later discovered that it was actually toxic to the livestock it was introduced to feed, and plots were left behind. And in that case, they simply spread from the plots. And it grows into dense thickets along roads and streams and in disturbed ground. Agricultural areas have seen communities of it pop up, and thickets tend to overwhelm the native species and decrease native biodiversity. It has a toxic substance in it called galigin, which is an alkaloid, and alkaloids will cause death in mammals if consumed in large enough quantities. So wildlife and livestock both suffer from it. It will decrease the blood pressure and paralyze the central nervous system eventually. And we definitely don't want to have folks or their animals exposed to this toxic plant. Because of that, it's an A and T listed species in Oregon. Oregon Department of Agriculture wants us to help map and find it and eliminate it wherever possible. These herbaceous shrubs can grow up to 6 feet tall. Like I said, they are multi-stemmed and they can form extensive thickets. The leaves are very distinctive, but they show something that is typical of the family. They're in the legume family or the pea family. So they have alternate compound leaves, much like a pea or a bean. They form 13 to 21 leaflets on each leaf, and they are up to 2 inches long. It has a terminal leaflet on the tip of each of these groupings, and its closest lookalike, the perennial or common vetch, have a little tendril at the tip of those pinnate leaves. Its stems are hollow and its flowers are clustered. They have 20 to 50 white or purplish flowers. They're usually pea-shaped, so they look like their family, and they can produce pods that contain up to 9 seeds each. Don't let your kiddos near these, even if they look kind of like a pea. And they're easiest to spot when they're in bloom, and they flower from June through first frost. So goat's rue is found in very few places in Oregon, fortunately, but Washington County is one of those. Of the sites, we have found goat's rue at an abandoned quarry, along a roadside, and in the West Hills. So goat's rue is being carefully monitored and all the populations are mapped. But if we find new populations, we need to know about those. That's where your help comes in. It has a special lookalike. Its lookalike is the common vetch, and common vetches are, as their name sake tells us, are very, very common. They'll be found in the same kinds of places, unfortunately, as goat's rue. The one species that looks the closest to it, most vetches are little viney things that grow and attach to other plants by tendrils to try to clamber their way up towards the light. Goat's rue will grow in a large shrub eventually, so it will not need those tendrils, and it does not develop any. But it does have one lookalike called the rosy bird's foot trefoil, and this species is similar in its leaves, flowers, and fruits, but the leaflets are oval shaped, not quite so lance shaped. It only grows to about half of the height and the width of the goat's rue, and the flowers grow in little clusters of 6 to 10. They're quite a bit smaller, and they're bright rose colored. They're rosy, as the name suggests, unlike the purplish whitish flowers of goat's rue. Our next beastie is the policeman's helmet, the Impatiens glandulifera, and some of its close relatives. This is a Himalayan relative to the garden impatiens that many people know, and it was brought over as an ornamental plant because it is quite decorative. The plant has beautiful pinkish to whitish, almost rose-colored flowers, which are very distinctive and very similar to many in the impatiens genus. The plant tends to grow very, very tall, unlike its relatives you would find in garden centers and in homes. and it forms very large thickets. It colonizes along stream banks. It loves lots of water, and it grows densely and displaces native plants eventually. It tends to threaten particularly songbirds and riparian wildlife because it displaces all of their native food sources and some of their habitat needs. The roots are very shallow, as you can see in the lower right photo. And because of that, they don't stabilize soils. So when the policeman's helmet dies down, as it does every year as an annual plant in the Pacific Northwest, those roots are not there to hold the soil, and erosion tends to happen. It spreads very quickly. It has large club-shaped seed pods, and like its relatives, otherwise known as touch-me-nots, when its seed pods are touched or even blown by the wind, they explosively release seeds violently up to 20 feet away. This used to be a fun exercise for kids to play with the touch-me-nots when they were in the garden. But for policeman's helmet, it means plants spread very rapidly. The seeds will stay viable up to 2 years, and they can still mature even on the plants after they're dying. It's a B-listed weed in Oregon. It's still a priority. It is unmistakable. It is a very, very tall annual plant with bright flowers. Its stems are smooth, often reddish, and they're very succulent or water-filled. And those extremely shallow roots mean it can be pulled out very easily from the soil. The flower will vary from that bright purple in the photo to a more of a white or pinkish color. There is one white flowered colony that has been found in Washington County, in fact. The leaves are egg-shaped, but in these cases, they have very strong teeth on the edges, and they're whorled. When to look for these? Usually at their peak blooming time and when they're at their full height, which would be June through August. It's a bright summertime plant, so look for it in the summer. And usually you would find it in wetlands and streams, as well as the edges of riparian areas. It does like sunlight, can tolerate some shade. Policeman's helmet has a fairly restricted distribution in the state of Oregon, fortunately, even though it would love our climate, so we are watching for it carefully. The population in Western Oregon has a large bullseye around the Portland metro area, but in Washington County, the populations remain low. The main infestation that we know about, thanks to one of our former trainees, is a population along Highton Creek, which is a tributary of Fano Creek in Tigard. There are also a few historic sites where it has potentially been eradicated. But because it's a beautiful plant, people like to grow it, and it would be worth tracking in urban spaces. There are a lot of different varieties of this plant. Some of its kissing cousins, if you will, are plants with whiter flowers or plants with different patterns on the faces of the flowers. So be aware that flower color can be extremely variable, but the easy characteristic is if you pull the plant out of the ground and you find these large succulent roots and a nice hollow stem on you will definitely have found one of the relatives of impatiens balsamariza.
Our next nasty invasive plant I'm going to talk about is purple loosestrife, and this is also known as the beautiful killer. It's native to Europe and was brought over as an ornamental. Seeds were also transported in ballast water ships. It will threaten wildlife habitat by producing enormous stands in shallow water. It outcompetes and displaces native riparian species. It decreases songbird and waterfowl production. It slows the water flow and it increases sedimentation. Negatively impacts juvenile salmon habitat. It promotes algae blooms. It reduces dissolved oxygen, and it can also clog irrigation ditches. The primary means by how it spreads is through seeds. And one mature adult plant can produce almost 3 million seeds annually, which is an amazing amount. Seeds will float downstream and infest slow-moving water. It does not colonize as well in faster moving water. The seeds will hitchhike on birds, boats, boots, and clothing, and the seeds will also blow in the wind and get transported that way. What to look for? It's a herbaceous perennial forming plant. It can grow up to 10 feet tall. The flowers are pink or purple, and they have 1 foot long spikes on the terminal branches. The spikes will often grow on the sides of the branches as well. The leaves are mostly opposite or whorled. They're occasionally alternate. They're lance-shaped with smooth edges, and they're 2 to 4 inches long. The stems are square. When to look for it, it usually starts growing in the spring through the summer. It's easy to see the flowers from about June through August. Where to look, it really likes moist soils and sunny conditions. You often see it growing in roadsides, ditches, wetlands, and slow-moving stream banks. And if you do spot it, we want you to report it, especially if you see it in a park or natural area or near water, be it a creek or a pond. Purple loosestrife distribution and population. It is widely distributed in Oregon with dense populations throughout western and southeastern Oregon. It's B-listed by the Oregon Department of Agriculture. The populations in Washington County are scattered along most of the waterways and in many right-of-way areas. You can see it on Fano Creek, Gulf Creek, McPhee Creek, Dairy Creek, Glencoe Creek, Wable Creek, and as well as along the Tualatin River. There are 2 native lookalikes. So the one on the left there is called Spirea, and that has similar looking flowers. The similarities are that it has long pink spikes and it grows in similar habitats and wetlands and likes moist soils. The differences with the Spirea is that with Spirea, it's got spikes that are fuzzy looking and they're pinker, and the stems are woody rather than square like purple loosestrife. The plant on the right there is called fireweed. It's another native. Similarities there are that it's the similar height, leaf shape, and it's got the purple flowers. Differences are that it lacks the shrubbiness or the side branches that purple loosestrife has, and the flower clusters are not as dense. So there's a biocontrol option to help keep purple loosestrife in check. And biocontrols like these beetles and weevils shown in these photos are natural predators of the purple loosestrife where it's native in Europe. Before releasing these controls in North America, the insects are carefully tested to ensure native plants aren't harmed. So there are actually 4 different biocontrol species for purple loosestrife. The 2 in the photo are the one on the left are the Hylobius root weevil, and then on the right there is the Galaricella black margin loosestrife beetle. And how these biocontrols control purple loosestrife is that over time, the root and leaf damage can stunt the plants and limit seed production, so keep it from spreading. The Hylobius root weevil will lay its eggs near the roots. The larva will mine into the roots and feed on tissue for two years. And then from July to October, the mature larvae become adults and find new infestations to feed on. The Galaricella beetles lay their eggs on the stem, and the larvae will feed on the leaves, stems, and buds. After 6 weeks, the larvae mature and disperse to new patches.
All right, our next invasive species is puncture vine, a native to Eurasia and Africa. This invasive species is becoming more widespread in the United States and is currently pretty common in the arid regions, particularly the southwestern states. With warming temperatures, the spread is increasing. Since it comes from such a dry area, it does require a lot of sunshine and tends to grow in sandy soils, but it is currently moving west into Western Oregon. It threatens agriculture just by outcompeting crops. It's very competitive. It's toxic to livestock, particularly sheep. And those sharp burrs that it produces are really painful to step on. These burrs can also impede travel through natural areas by wildlife. It does get stuck in paws, hooves, and in fur, and it's just a really painful burr. Flooding events can also move these burrs along with their seeds along waterways. The burrs are also known contaminants in hay, straw, and manure, which leads to them being spread around in agricultural areas. Puncture vine is a B-listed species in Oregon. It's pretty common in other regions in Oregon. It's an annual herbaceous ground cover. It can grow, the mats can grow pretty thick, up to about 2 feet. It just kind of grows over itself. You can see in the bottom right photo here, it has kind of a pretty little flower that blooms from the base of the leaves. The flower is composed of 5 yellow petals, and it opens in the morning and closes in the evening. It blooms in early spring and will continue to bloom until fall when it dies back. After it's pollinated, it forms segmented burrs that we were talking about earlier, several weeks after blooming. Those burrs are broken into 4 to 5 segments, and each one of those segments has 2 long, sharp spines, and each segment kind of has the appearance of a quote unquote goat's head, which is another common name for the species. The leaves are opposite. One of the leaf pairs is always about half the size of the other. And coincidentally, that will be the leaf in which the flower blooms from, the axil. Each leaf is composed of 3 to 8 opposite pairs of leaflets. And one of the paired leaflets will be smaller on the other side. The leaves are hairy, as well as the stems, which trail from a central taproot and can grow to be about 6 feet long. So you can find this plant from April to October when the flowers and burrs are present. It's pretty easy to identify, especially when those bright yellow petals are open during the day. I'd be wary about walking through areas with puncture vine because those burrs really do hurt and they get stuck in your boots and get tracked around. You can look for it in dry, disturbed areas with plenty of sun. They tend to grow in spots with sandy soil, but they can also grow in areas with clay or loamy soil. They're a pretty hardy species. So puncture vine is very common in central and eastern Oregon, mainly because of the arid climate and the frequent sun. Again, changing temperatures are changing patterns, and puncture vine is being found in Western Oregon more and more. Puncture vine has been reported in Washington County, mostly in the vicinity of North Plains. There was a burr found at LL Stubbs Stewart. We haven't found a plant yet, and we're hoping that we won't, but it's good to be diligent. If you see this weed, please report it to us. Milk thistle is an interesting weed. It's native to the Middle East, North Africa, India, and parts of Southeastern Europe. It was potentially originally planted in North America for medical reasons and has since spread to encompass large amounts of land in other parts of the country. It's an herbaceous biennial and B-listed in Oregon. So it's a threat to agricultural communities and is being found more and more in urban settings. Its foliage accumulates nitrates, causing it to be toxic to livestock. It forms really dense thickets in agricultural areas and grasslands, and outcompetes native grass species as well as crop species. The long spines produced on the foliage and around the flowers injure livestock and hinder their access to fields. You can see in the bottom left photo just how dense those infestations get. And if I was a cow, I would not want to walk through that. So the seeds are dispersed over short distances in the wind. Like other thistle species, they tend to have kind of a feathery fluff that grows on there, but they're kind of heavy comparatively. So they don't tend to travel as far. But farm equipment, cars, animals' fur, and clothing tend to move these seeds to new locations. Another reason it gets spread around so much is it's a known contaminant in hay, gravel, and soil. And each plant can grow about 6,000 seeds annually. So, you know, in a dense infestation like the one on the bottom left, you can imagine that there are a lot of seeds being spread around. The seeds themselves can remain viable in the soil for up to 9 years. So again, this is another plant that needs to be monitored for a long time after it's been removed. Those seeds can pop back up several years afterwards and produce new infestations. So milk thistle gets its common name because of the leaves you can see have a very strong white variegation. Those leaves can get really big, up to 2 feet long. The rosettes are much larger than some other thistles that you might see, such as Canada thistle. The leaves are wavy, not lobed. The edges are very prickly. It's very hard to remove milk thistle by hand because of how prickly they are. And yeah, again, that white variegation kind of gives it the look that someone spilled milk on it. So the flowering stems begin to bolt in the early spring of the second year of growth. They can grow to be about 6 feet tall. They lack spines, unlike some other thistles. They're more ridged and they're hollow. They also have some sparse hairs along the stem, so a good way to identify milk thistle in that way. The flower heads are borne singly at the end of stems, and they can get pretty large, about 2 inches across. The flowers are purple, and as you can see, they're encircled by those very large spines. So it's easiest to look for milk thistle when in flower, just because of how tall it is and how big the flower heads are. However, the rosettes are pretty easy to spot just due to their size and the white variegation. You can find milk thistle in sunny fields, in agricultural settings, also in yards, disturbed areas, rights of way, and meadows. It tends to like areas with a higher nutrient content in the soil. So that's a lot of the reason why it does tend to grow so well in these agricultural sites. So we have one lookalike for you for milk thistle, and that is Italian thistle, which is also a noxious weed that we are tracking in Washington County. So if you do see Italian thistle, we'd love to hear about it. They both share white variegated leaves, particularly the rosette of Italian thistle does have that white variegation that you can see. And they both have purple flowers as well. So milk thistle's white variegation is a little more pronounced than Italian thistle's. And you can see from the picture there that Italian thistle rosette leaves are pretty deeply lobed, whereas the milk thistle leaves are actually kind of wavy instead of lobed. Italian thistle also has much smaller flower heads, and they're borne in clusters, whereas milk thistle has those single flower heads that are pretty large. Italian thistle also has a winged stem. So if you see there's like kind of a lobed wing along the stem there with thorns or prickles, and milk thistle lacks that. So milk thistle mainly grows in Western Oregon, particularly in southwestern Oregon near the coast. Washington County does have several infestations in the southern portion of the county near Clackamas County. However, we have been getting reports in other areas, more urban areas, of milk thistle growing in yards, so it's good to keep your eye out. More data is needed to assess milk thistle populations in this county. It's kind of new to us, and we'd like to know where it's growing so we can track the infestations. All right, giant reed, which is a very tall grass. It's native to the Middle East. It was introduced to North America as an ornamental species, and surprisingly for building materials as well. It's an herbaceous, rhizomatous, perennial grass that grows much taller than other grasses you might be familiar with. Its stems grow from a rhizome in the spring, dying back in the winter and kind of leaving those dead canes on the ground, kind of similar to knotweed. It's a B-listed species in Oregon, and it's a large threat to our riparian areas. Giant reed creates extremely dense stands in riparian areas. Those stands exclude native trees and shrubs. They decrease the shade on the water, increasing water temperatures. Infestations also increase sedimentation and decrease water quality. So stands use a large amount of water as well, decreasing groundwater in arid regions. This has been documented in Southern California, where giant reed was found to use nearly 3 times as much water as native riparian plants. And as temperatures increase, that's certainly something that we don't need in our riparian areas. Lastly, the canes are highly flammable and increase the risk of wildfires in riparian areas, which is becoming more and more of an issue. So giant reed spreads entirely through rhizome fragmentation. In North America, the seeds aren't viable, so it doesn't reproduce through seed. The canes can also produce new shoots from the nodes, and you can see that in a picture that we took in the bottom right. That cane had just fallen over and it just readily resprouted from the node. Floods will fragment the rhizome and spread them along waterways. In that way, it spreads kind of similarly to knotweed. And sometimes it is utilized as an ornamental. We have found it being grown in yards and on people's properties. Just because of its large height, people tend to think it's cool looking. You can see in the top right photo there that someone unfortunately planted it along a fence, and it's easily overtaking that fence. So the flowers are cream colored. They're plumes that grow up to 2 feet long, and they bloom at the end of stems. Again, they don't produce viable seeds, and they tend to bloom from March through November. The leaves are alternate. They're gray-green to bright green. They grow really long, up to 2 feet long. You can kind of tell giant reed apart from other grasses early on because of the long, wavy white hairs where the leaf meets the stem. Ornamental varieties are something to be aware of. Some people do, there are ornamental varieties that exist with variegated leaves, so they don't always look the way they do on these photos. The stems are erect. They kind of look like bamboo from a distance, so sometimes it might take some observation closer to the plant to actually distinguish it from bamboo. They can grow to be about 27 feet tall, and they grow from rhizome, those rhizomes being very thick and creating numerous networks underground. It's easiest to spot in midsummer when at peak height. It may, again, take some closer inspection to distinguish it from bamboo. It grows, again, in most moist soils with full sun, in riparian areas, yards, stream sides, and in ditches. So giant reed has a patchy distribution in Oregon. In Washington County, we've seen it growing at several private residences. This is definitely a plant we want to keep away from our riparian areas and growing along streams just because of all the problems it brings with it. So it's kind of in the early detection phase here. All right, so our next invasive is parrot feather. Parrot feather is an aquatic invasive from South America that was introduced to North America via the aquarium trade. Infestations of parrot feather can completely cover entire bodies of water and smother out native aquatic species. A parrot feather also blocks slow-moving waterways, increases sedimentation, and creates prime mosquito breeding habitat, which I'm assuming no one would want. So it spreads entirely through stem fragmentation. Both the male and female plants are needed for viable seed, but so far we've only documented female plants in Oregon. So what happens is the stem fragments detach and drift downstream where they can spread by hitching a ride on waterfowl or boats. And parrot feather can also be introduced to water bodies when aquarium owners dump tanks in ponds or creeks. So definitely don't be dumping any water tanks into the creeks there because it leads to the spread of parrot feather if you have parrot feather in it. It's a B-listed species in Oregon, and please report parrot feather if you find it in Washington County. It's a perennial species with stems that grow to be about 5 feet long. And when the water kind of goes down, sometimes they poke out of the water a little bit, as you can see in the bottom left photo there. The leaves are whorled and feather looking with 20 to 30 small lobes per leaf and 4 to 6 per node, 4 to 6 leaves per node. The flowers are small and translucent and grow at the base of the leaf. They're pretty inconspicuous, so it's not something you would see from a distance. But those stems can creep up onto land a little bit, especially in the muddy sediment, up to 3 feet, sometimes more. They don't need to be completely submerged to survive, but they do tend to like that shallow, slow-moving water. It's easiest to see parrot feather from July to September when the water line recedes and exposes those stems. And you want to look in slow-moving to non-moving waters, such as lakes, ponds, streams, and back channels. Parrot feather is widespread in Western Oregon and is found in nearly every county west of the Cascades. It's currently being monitored and treated at several sites in Washington County. More data is needed to properly assess the entire distribution, but it is being monitored at several sites. Definitely not a plant we want to see take off like the others.
Okay, so I'm just going to kind of go over what we've covered so far and some of the weeds that we're asking people to report. So our priority species on the left there are garlic mustard, knotweed, giant hogweed, purple loosestrife, spurge laurel, and false brome. And then our early detection rapid response species on the right there are goat's rue, giant reed, puncture vine, oblong spurge, milk thistle, parrot feather, and policeman's helmet. So those are the species we want people to report anywhere in Washington County. For the early detection rapid response species, those are ones that might not be as well established as the priority species. So it's more important to get on those early. I'm just going to kind of go through some of our 4 priority species. The first one being garlic mustard, and talking about kind of historical treatment data and progress that we've been making. So I just want to give a little background. The Tualatin SWCD took over the invasive species program from Clean Water Service in 2018. Clean Water Services had been managing weeds in the Tualatin watershed since 2009 and made good progress controlling 3 priority species: garlic mustard, woody knotweed, and giant hogweed. For garlic mustard, since 2009, where there's about 75 net acres that were treated, we've made great lengths and improvements in reducing infestations by 96% to just over 3 acres this last year. This last year, there were about 62 stream miles that were surveyed, 940 gross acres that were surveyed, and then, like I said, 3 acres that were treated by either our contracted crews or our in-house staff from March to June and September to October. We had 5 new sites that were treated, the largest of which was a 1/4 acre site near Tualatin. The creeks that were surveyed and treated include Gales Creek, Abbey Creek, Rock Creek, Bronson Creek, Ward Creek, Johnson Creek, Fano Creek, Sylvan Creek, Cedar Mill Creek, Gulf Creek, and plus the site along the Tualatin River on unnamed tributary. Knotweed. So this last year, there were about 62 stream miles that were surveyed and 800 gross acres surveyed. Close to 2 acres, net acres were treated. And there's been about a 97% reduction in the known total infestation size since 2009, where there was about 56 net acres that were treated. We've been getting a lot of phone calls and emails from landowners telling us about new infestations. So we were able to treat a lot of new sites this last year. So we're really appreciative to people for letting us know about those. The creeks that are surveyed and treated include Gales, East Fork Dairy, West Fork Dairy, Fano, Sylvan, Abbey, Rock, Johnson, Cedar Mill, and Ward Creeks, as well as the Tualatin River. The giant hogweed, this is invasive that's primarily found on Fano Creek. And this last year, there were about 3.8 stream miles that were surveyed and about 682 net square feet that were treated. So small patch size. While the infestation area hasn't significantly decreased since 2012 when treatment began, there has been about a 40% reduction in the number of known patches from the peak in 2014 from 106 patches to about 64 patches this last year. And the good news is that only one of those patches was flowering and was able to produce seed. So we're only really finding plants that don't have any seed, so they're not able to spread. The last one is purple loosestrife. And this one we haven't been doing as many years of treatment on, but it's one where just every year we keep learning more about it and kind of seeing how it's distributed across the county. Last year, there were about 0.78 net acres that were treated from July to August and September. And that's when it's usually in bloom. easiest to detect and treat. The creeks surveyed include Fano, Derry, Johnson, and Gulf Creeks, as well as the Tualatin River. We did have some biocontrols that were released, some of the Gallericella beetles at a Gulf Creek site that was very successful, with plants showing heavy feeding damage from adult beetles. There was also another site at Wapato Lake that has some of those beetles released, and there hasn't been any damage noticed yet, but we expect there to be in the coming years. So yeah, our permit of entry letters. So this is something, or permit of entry or POE letters. This is something that's mailed out in late January, early February each year to request permission to access landowners' properties to survey for and control priority weeds. While we have made much progress in the fight against priority weeds, we are trying to work with as many landowners as we can to survey for and control all known infestations. If you receive this POE letter, please send back as soon as you can. We can notify you ahead of time when we or our contracted crews will be out and work with you to determine the appropriate control method for your property. A big thank you to all the landowners who have granted permission for us to control weeds on your property. We really appreciate it.
Okay, now we are going to learn how to report these invasive species. You'll go to the Oregon Invasives Hotline.org and click on Report Now. On the left, you can see what an iPad or web screen looks like, and on the right, what an iPhone or mobile device would look like. You'll enter your first and last name and email. So whoever's responding to your report can ask any additional questions that come up as we're trying to find the weed, or the agency has additional questions about your identification. You'll be asked, where is the species that you found? It'll automatically go to a certain location, but feel free to move the map until the pin is where you saw the invasive, or enter an address, or even the latitude and longitude coordinates in the address box. And then provide a description on, once we get to that address or that longitude and latitude, of how we get to the species. So if there's a trail that we need to go by, or a landmark that will help us get to that exact plant that you were talking about, that is super helpful for us, so we aren't trying to search a couple acres to find that species that you're reporting. So you can choose from aquatic invertebrates, aquatic plants, birds, fish, insects and spiders, land mollusks and worms, land plants, mammals, microorganisms, reptiles and amphibians, and tunicates, also known as marine invertebrates. Our agency will respond often to the aquatic plants and land plants, but other agencies such as Oregon Department of Forestry and Oregon Fish and Wildlife, they will respond to some of the other invasives that are reported. Here you'll provide a description of the plant that you found. What species do you think it is, or a description of the plant and any damage that you think it's causing there to help us identify the plant. Next, we ask that you take 2 photos, one at a distance so that the whole infestation or plant is in the photo, and then a close-up of the plant that gives us some distinct features such as the leaves, flowers, or other information to help us identify the plant. And then if you have any other questions for the expert that will be responding to your report, feel free to leave it in the bottom box and they will respond to your questions and get back to you as soon as possible. Sometimes it can take up to a week for a response from different agencies. So now that you've gone through our training, we're going to teach you how to not be a vector and clean up before leaving a site. So before you leave after a hike, a bike ride, or riding on your ATV, or just taking your dog to the park, check your clothes, your pets, and clean off any seeds or mud. Clean your equipment, your vehicle if you've gone driving on any dirt roads. And if possible, while you're out on these walks or hikes, walk around an infestation because those seeds can be very small and hide in the bottoms of your shoes. As you can see in the bottom left photo, there's probably seeds caked into that mud on the bottom of their shoe. And dogs easily pick it up on their paws or fur, especially longer haired dogs. It's easy for those species to hide in there and get spread and dropped other places that it's unwanted. If while you're out on a walk or hike, if you do remove an invasive species, please put it in a bag and place it in the trash or burn it. Do not compost it because that can just increase the spread. If you're collecting a specimen in flower or fruit, make sure to seal the bag to reduce any spreading on your way out of the site. Places like Stubbs Stewart actually offer a place for you to wash down your mountain bike when you're done for the day to help avoid spreading invasive species. Your bike gets covered in mud, you get covered in mud, and this gives an easy way for them to offer a way for you to clean your equipment, and all the water goes into a swale that they can monitor for species that can be found on their property. So other ways you can help reduce the spread is when you travel to other countries, always declare your agricultural goods. Even in the US, traveling to California and other states where they grow oranges or apples can bring, you can take unwanted ecological pests that can cause huge problems. So don't let your vacation turn into an ecological problem. Make sure you declare all those agricultural goods because things can hide in them very easily. If you're planning on hopping on a horse soon, such as at Stubbs Stewart State Park, make sure you use forage or hay that is certified as weed-free and clean your horse and gear after every trip to avoid moving unwanted hitchhikers. When you go camping, make sure you don't move firewood. Invasive insects like the emerald ash borer hitch a ride on firewood from affected areas such as the East Coast, and if they make their way here, can have a detrimental effect on our native ash trees. So burn the wood where you find it. When you're out on the water, make sure that you can clean, drain, and dry your boat when you're done. You got to make sure it is completely dry, and it's best to leave it dry for a good amount of time between different waters, just to make sure that all of the species, if you've collected anything that's hiding in the little nooks and crannies, is dry and cannot reconstitute some water and still be alive. One species that is being reported as an issue around the US right now is these Marimo moss balls, and they've actually been found to be containing zebra mussels. Zebra mussels can cause a huge detrimental effect on our infrastructure and our waterways. They actually will kill our native mussels, and they will get into dams and cause our electricity and energy prices to increase significantly because they can cause so much issues and completely clog up turbines. If you do have an aquarium at home, please do not let any of your pets loose. Don't let a goldfish or anything else, even though you think you're doing it, you're letting it go and you think you're doing the best thing for it. It is often very detrimental to the environment and can make the pet suffer. So if you do have a pet that you no longer want, please report it to the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they will help you get in contact with someone who can take that pet off your hands. Here are some resources, and we will also provide this after you watch the presentation and take our quiz. We will also be providing you with some links to these organizations as well as some others. So OSU Extension offers research-based information on weed management, different agricultural and forestry practices, and environmental stewardship. The Pacific Northwest Pest Management Handbook offers species-specific control information and effective herbicides and effective timing for treating those weeds. The University of California Weed Research and Information Center offers research-based information on weed management and herbicides. The National Pesticide Information Center offers objective, science-based information about specific pesticides. You can search herbicides for health information before use, and they're a great group to just call if you have any questions about herbicides, pesticides, anything that is in those categories that you have questions about. They are happy to answer your questions both by email or on the phone, and they're very knowledgeable and can be a great resource. These links will be provided to you in an email after the presentation and quiz. Thank you for watching. And as I said, additional resources will be available for you to manage invasive species on your property in the links below. We also ask that you please click the quiz link below this video to test your knowledge and ask questions of the experts. Once you take the quiz, if you enter your address in there, we will mail you an EDRR guide, boot brush, and other goodies for you to have and help clean and keep these invasive species out of our county. Thank you.